Ooh, it's time for some scary tales from the rails. The rails in question being those on the mythical island of Sodor, home to the engines of the Railway series. Now, the Railway series was the creation of the Reverend Wilbert Awdry. Originally, they were just stories he told to his son Christopher, but with the encouragement of his wife, they became much more. Over the course of 75 years, they've gone from published books to the basis of a well-loved children's show, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. You'd think that being the inspiration for a TV series aimed at young kids, that the stories from these books would be friendly and innocent fun, right? Wrong! The stories from the original Railway series were not always as cheerful as the most popular illustrations from them would indicate. Some of the tales from these books could be downright macabre. In taking a look at the most terrifying ones, you'll see what I mean. Before I get started, I'd like to point out that this video isn't going to be about the show. I may use episodes from it to better illustrate the action, but this video doesn't focus on the show. So, without further ado, time to see what chilling tales these books hold. The Reverend W. Awdry originally told his son Christopher stories about 3 engines to keep him amused while he was ill in bed with the measles. The stories involved Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Henry was first introduced in the aptly named tale, The Sad Story of Henry, which began with this limerick.
Once an engine, attached to a train, was afraid of a few drops of rain. It went into a tunnel, and squeaked through its funnel, and never came out again.
That word never foreshadows the outcome of the events in this story. It's kind of important to remember. Anyhow, we get introduced to Henry, a stubborn engine who hides in the tunnel and won't come out because
the rain will spoil my lovely green paint with red stripes.
No matter how much the passengers and Henry's crew tried to prod him, nothing will make him leave the tunnel. Even after he's told the rain is stopped, he says,
"Yes, but it'll begin again soon, and what will become of my green paint with red stripes then?"
After multiple attempts to get him out fail, the decision is made to take the rails away and leave Henry in there.
For always and always and always.
They do just that, bricking up the tunnel in the process. So Henry is left to sadly watch the trains run through the tunnel next to him while he remains alone, imprisoned because of his own conceit. This harrowing story ends with the narrator saying,
"But I think he deserved it, don't you?"
That's quite a crushing blow right there. Poor Henry's petty concern for his paint job results in him getting a punishment straight out of an Edgar Allan Poe tale. Surely bricking him into a tunnel was a bit much. And yeah, if you think about it, this is also a punishment for the railway itself. I mean, you're diverting traffic to one tunnel exclusively and letting a presumably expensive piece of machinery go to waste in the other. But as with most children's stories, the lesson is the most important thing to take away from this. That lesson being, don't put your paintwork above your passengers. To be fair, Henry was eventually let out of the tunnel when Gordon bursts a safety valve and Edward can't pull his train on his own. How much time elapsed between Henry's imprisonment and release is never established, though. It was stated that Henry had cobwebs all over him, so it was probably quite a while. The story of Henry coming to Gordon's rescue was never originally one of the Reverend's tales he told to his son. It was devised at the insistence of the publishers to bring the 3 engines together for a happy ending. So if the Railway series were never published, Henry would still be in that tunnel. That's one instance where I think a marketing decision proved to be for the best. Henry would be useful for further stories in the Railway series and most assuredly learned his lesson. No need to keep him in the tunnel permanently.
But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you?
He had potential. Some of the stories in the Railway series focused on engines who worked different railway lines to those serviced by Thomas and his friends. The most frequently featured of these other railways was the narrow gauge line. This line included characters like Skarloey, Rheneas, Peter Sam, and these other guys. In comparison to the engines on the standard gauge, the Skarloey engines were puny, but the stories they had were no less compelling. I should probably point out that the TV series had all the narrow gauge engines colored differently, whereas in the books almost all of them were red. I can't say I blame the showrunners for making that decision. In an illustration like this one, it can be hard to tell who's who when they're pretty much all the same color. One of the stories from the book The Little Old Engine was the story Little Old Twins, in which Skarloey talks about his real-life twin in Wales. While this tale ends on a happier note than the sad story of Henry, not everything that takes place in it is so cheery. When Peter Sam hears and sees men talking about taking things all over their line, he worries that he and the other engines will be sold. He is eventually talked out of his misery by his driver, who tells him that the men are television producers who are going to document their railway. This gets Peter Sam and all the other engines excited. All of them except one named Sir Handel.
I don't hold with it, he grumbled. Vulgar, I call it. Fancy tripsing about making an exhibition of yourselves.
Oh, just wait until Vine, Instagram, and other social media sites come along, Sir Handel. He plans to tell the Thin Controller that he won't go along with it. When the Thin Controller says he wants full participation from every engine, Sir Handel pretends to feel ill. The Thin Controller says that he can stay in the shed.
And your driver and fireman shall take you to pieces. That will make a very interesting picture.
Wow, that's a way to deal with insubordination. You can't just say, tough beans, bub, you're doing this whether you like it or not. You're gonna have him dismantled on camera.
Sir Handel's feelings were beyond words.
No kidding. I mean, imagine if something like this happened at your job when your boss expected full participation from everyone. Okay, well, I don't think dismemberment of any kind would happen at very many jobs, unless you worked at a hospital. Alright everyone, we're going to have some students coming over from the medical college to watch us perform an open heart surgery. Now I expect everybody's full participation, so sir, I don't feel too good. Mind if I sit this one out? Okay, Alex, you can be excused from this. Leah, tell Mr. Jacobson we'll have to reschedule his surgery. So you're canceling the whole thing? No, Alex, we're gonna perform the surgery on you. Wait, what? Yeah, I think if Sir Handel weren't a steam engine, there'd be a lawsuit against the Thin Controller from him. Despite how much of a twit Sir Handel can be sometimes, this is one of those instances where you can't help but feel a little sympathetic toward him. Unlike the other three stories from The Little Old Engine, this story was not adapted for the television show for reasons unknown. I suppose it was probably for the best, though. I don't think kids would react well to hearing an engine be told that he'll be taken apart to be shown on camera. There were plenty of other hardcore events showcased in the TV series, and in the Railway series itself, though, which brings us to our next entry. The freight cars, or troublesome trucks to give them their proper UK terminology, were always the bane of the engine's existences. Described as silly and noisy things that don't listen to their engine, these guys were known for creating all kinds of distress, from slowing the journey down for an engine or even causing huge accidents. Though, I will say, the accidents were always some of the best moments in the TV series. Anyway, it always took an engine with determination to know how to handle the trucks. Sometimes, however, the engines ended up getting more than they bargained for. 2 instances of this were showcased in the original Railway series. The first came in Brake Van, a story from the twin engines. This book dealt with 2 secondary characters, the Scottish twins Donald and Douglas, who want to prove their worth so that they can both stay on the Fat Controller's railway. Mishaps and confusion happen along the way, making things difficult for both. A brake van, for example, keeps making Douglas late with his trains and getting him into trouble. Taking concern for his brother, Donald decides to give the van a piece of his mind.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I'd be wanting. You can't, said the van. I'm essential. Oh, Kaya, Donald burst out. You're nothing but a screeching and a noise when all's said and done. Spot Dougie, would you? Take that! Oh, oh, oh! cried the van. There's more coming, should you misbehave.
So, Donald gets the van to behave, and Douglas is able to keep better time with his trains. One day, however, Donald has an accident. This leaves James to help with the goods work while Donald is being mended. And I guess the brake van either didn't think Donald's warning applied to engines beyond him and Douglas, or it just stopped caring, because now James has to deal with the van's obnoxiousness. When his whole train is made heavier for him, James decides to ask Douglas for help up the hill beyond Edward Station. Douglas willingly obliges, but when James starts losing steam, Douglas tries making up for it. And this happens.
Go steady! The van's breaking! The van was in pieces.
Yeah, he just gave a whole new meaning to the term brake van. I mean, look at that. He crushed it like an empty soda can beneath a grown man's foot. Of course, Douglas gets into trouble with Sir Topham Hatt, who, though admiring of his determination in trying to help James, doesn't know what to do with Douglas. When the twins discuss this situation in the next story, the other engines sympathize with them, showing no concern for the brake van.
Good riddance! That's what I say!
Being more popular with the engines than that vicious piece of rolling stock, Donald and Douglas are eventually allowed to stay on the Fat Controller's railway. We never hear about any kind of redemption for the brake van, though. I know it wasn't exactly popular with the engines, but what a way to go. Another story featuring the demise of a piece of rolling stock was in Toad Stands By. This story begins with the trucks teasing Oliver, a Great Western tank engine whom they pushed into a turntable well. A private owner wagon named Scruffy leads the trucks in a song at Oliver's expense.
Oliver's no use at all, thinks he's very clever, says that he can manage us, that's the best joke ever. When the yacht is up perhaps, when the grace is falling, we just push him down the well. Pop goes old Dolly.
Not quite as clever as Pop Goes the Diesel from a previous story, but what can you expect from trucks? Despite his friends telling them off and bumping them, nothing can get the trucks to stop teasing Oliver for long. This is when the brake van Toad speaks up. Unlike the brake van mentioned previously, Toad is kind and respectful to the engines. He talks to Oliver about a plan he has, and they put it into action. When Oliver has to take another goods train, he arranges the trucks 2 by 2 in front of Toad, leaving Scruffy until last. When Oliver is ready to start, the trucks try to hold him back, but Oliver has the upper wheel, though. See, he has sand beneath his wheels to give him traction, and when the trucks try holding him back, Oliver pulls against them. This proves to be too much for Scruffy at the front. With his fellow trucks and an engine pulling him in opposite directions, he has trouble keeping it together.
I'm coming apart!
See what I mean? Oliver literally tore him a new one. That expression on Scruffy's face says it all. When Sir Topham Hatt arrives and inspects the remains, he figures that Scruffy's demise was inevitable due to his condition. He then whispers to Oliver,
Don't tell the trucks that. Bad for discipline.
before leaving. He's not about to let them have any kind of vengeance. After this, Oliver is only tasked with taking goods trains when the other engines are busy. His struggle with Scruffy has left its impact, though, as the trucks are now quick to warn each other about what happens to trucks who play tricks on Oliver. Now, in the TV series adaptation, Scruffy was rebuilt, but the original story from the book never shows that happening. What I can conclude from that is that he was scrapped afterward. Such are the consequences for a nasty freight car. As you can see, these guys are no easy things to deal with, and if an engine doesn't keep control of them, it can be disastrous. These two instances, however, show that there can be such a thing as too much control. As troublesome as the trucks could be, I don't think an engine would want to gain a reputation as a destroyer of rolling stock. Don't want to be any more troublesome than the goods you pull, I'd say. Among the less remembered characters from the Railway series are the mountain engines on the Culdee Fell Railway. These odd-looking engines only ever appeared in one book, and were never in the TV series either. They had some captivating tales to tell in their lone literary appearance to their name nonetheless, including one which was pretty hardcore, Bad Lookout. This story begins with Chaldee talking to the narrow-gauge engines Skarloey and Rheneas while waiting to be taken back to his own railway. Duncan suddenly comes up along with Sir Handel and complains about how he was nearly pushed off the rails by his coaches and that the thin controller didn't believe him when he told him about it.
He says I kept a bad lookout. We've no money to mend you, he said. And if it happens again, I'll leave you at the back of the shed. Why does he always pick on me? It's no fair.
Yeah, Duncan was quite the complainer in the books, and I have the feeling that his speech would be more profanity-laced had the Railway series been aimed at an older audience. After answering a few questions from the other engines about his railway, Chaldee tells them about an engine named Godred. According to Chaldee, Godred was quite a careless engine who never kept a good lookout, something which was all too important on the mountain railway. Warnings from Chaldee, the manager, and Godred's crew did nothing. Even taking him apart to check for anything wrong resulted in no change in his ways. Although I think Godred probably felt a little more violated than anything after that. Anyway, one day when Chaldee was waiting for him at a station, Godred was coming down too fast.
One moment he was on the track. The next, his driver and fireman jumped clear as he rolled over.
A plume of smoke at the bottom of the illustration is the last view we get of Godred. Given that the railway is on a mountain, it's not hard to tell where Godred rolled. When he's brought home the next day, the manager tells Godred the same thing the thin controller reprimanded Duncan with earlier.
We've no money to mend you, so you'll go to the back of the shed.
No amount of welding or metalwork or WD-40 is going to repair the after effects of crashing down a mountain. Chaldee ends the story with saying,
As time went on, poor Godred got smaller and smaller, till nothing was left.
So, what happened to this incredible shrinking engine? Only after Duncan insists in knowing does Chaldee finally say,
Our drivers used Godred's parts to mend us.
Duncan and Sir Handel, clearly mortified by this, have little to say as Chaldee is taken back to his own railway. Yeah, nothing like the tale about an engine being cannibalized for spare parts to teach other engines about the value of caution. But there's one little thing Duncan and Sir Handel don't know.
Neither Skarloey nor Rheneas ever mentioned that Chaldee had made the story up.
So Godred's demise didn't really happen then? Well, way to scare sense into two arrogant locomotives, Chaldee. You quite possibly gave them a bit of psychological shock as well. Seriously, do any of these guys need counseling after what they experience, I wonder? Does a therapist have to come by the engine sheds and have counseling sessions with any of them? What am I saying? There's no way Sir Topham Hatt would pay for anything like that. I guess you could say those instances were all ways in which they built character. As for the mountain engines, we can only wonder about the other adventures these guys had beyond the 4 stories in the one book. According to the Reverend Audrey's son Christopher, who took up his father's role as series author after his father's retirement, the safety precautions and limited traffic on the Chaldee Fell Railway basically preclude any further story opportunities for them. Since the television series is not likely to include these engines either, I mean, it wouldn't be very cost-productive to make engines and an entire set that only show up in a few episodes and are never seen again afterwards. The exploits of the mountain engines are likely to only ever be seen or heard in literary form. Being a stickler for realism with regards to the stories in his books, the Reverend Audrey took note of the changes and developments on British railways as the series moved forward. Many times, the events of the day were not so rosy for the steam locomotives he featured so frequently. One such example is in the opening story of the book Stepney the Bluebell Engine. When talking with Douglas one day, Percy mentions news he heard from the Fat Controller.
Engines on the other railway aren't safe now. Their controllers are cruel. They don't like engines anymore. They put them on cold, damp sidings. And then Percy nearly sobbed. They cut him up.
As he is saying this, we get treated to this gruesome illustration of two nameless steam engines about to meet their end at the cutter's torch. Quite a depressing scene for a children's book. Sad as it was, this sort of thing was becoming more commonplace on railways all over the world with the advent of dieselization. With their cost-effective operation and maintenance, diesels would gradually supersede steam engines in regular use, leading to many such engines being scrapped. The first diesel introduced to the railway series turned out to be a rather nasty one that hurt the engines with his lies. So diesels gained a rather negative reputation in the railway series. This may have been part of what prompted Douglas to say this.
It's all because of yon diesels. They're all devils, he added fiercely.
Percy is quick to remind Douglas that not all diesels are like that, pointing to Rusty and Daisy as some examples of nice diesels. Now that's a good thing to remember. The Railway series and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends as a whole has often been criticized for its supposed racist and authoritarian tone. The treatment of diesels with a kind of disdain by the steam engines is one thing that's often brought up as an example of this. However, with Percy's statement, we learn that not all steam engines have this prejudice, and that not all diesels are nasty. It's moments like this that show how there was more to the characters in the books than surface-level observations imply. Percy also talks about the Bluebell Railway, which is a real line in Sussex. This railway acts as a safe haven for steam engines by helping to preserve them. The people who run it make sure the steam engines are well cared for and have everything they need. With excitement, Percy announces to Douglas that Stepney, the first locomotive to escape to the Bluebell Railway, is coming to Soper, thus giving the book its title character. The story ends with Douglas and Percy seeing Stepney pass through the junction to begin his visit. In spite of the dark tone set at the beginning of this story, it quickly turns happy, showing that hope isn't all lost for steam engines, and that good can come even in the saddest situations. Another admirable quality of the Reverend's books. This story, like a few others before it, wasn't exactly adapted for the television series. I assume it wasn't solely because of this, but also because the whole story is basically just Douglas and Percy talking with each other. Even if flashbacks or cutaways were shown, that would still be a pretty boring episode. While Stepney did show up in the Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends series, his introduction was completely changed. Nonetheless, Stepney's stories are some of the best examples of the reality of being a steam engine in changing times. Another engine who learned about the hardships of shifting railway practices in the books was Gordon. The book Enterprising Engines began with Gordon complaining about not feeling happy. The others don't take him seriously, thinking either he has an issue with his firebox or that he has boiler ache due to taking on bad water. Unable to make them listen, Gordon goes to the station to collect his train. When he sees the fat controller there, he explains his troubles to him.
I keep thinking about the dreadful state of the world, sir. Is it true, sir, what the diesels say? What do they say? They boast that they've abolished steam, sir. Yes, Gordon, it is true.
He wasn't kidding. In 1968, British Railways officially withdrew steam engines from active service. Now the struggle for steam engine survival was real. This book captured the effect the eradication of steam had. More on that later, though. Gordon then asks Sir Topham Hatt about all of his Doncaster brothers.
All gone, except one.
With that devastating bit of news, Gordon sadly steams away with his train. For the record, all the engines featured in the Railway series were based on real locomotives that worked at some point or another on the railways in Britain. But by this time, many of those engines had their fate sealed by the scrapyard. When Gordon learns that he's one of only 2 engines of his class left, you feel more of an emotional connection with trains than ever, and not just the ones in these books. Of course, Sir Topham Hatt takes pity on Gordon, knowing how hurt he is over losing all but one of his brothers. He gets an idea. One night, Gordon gets a happy surprise when he sees an engine with 2 tenders backing into the shed berth next to him. The engine with the 2 tenders is Flying Scotsman. another real-life engine and Gordon's last surviving brother. Gordon is overjoyed by what the Fat Controller has done for him, and Flying Scotsman remained on Sodor until the beginning of the last story in Enterprising Engines. When he leaves, the Fat Controller sees him off with these words.
Please tell everyone that whatever happens elsewhere, steam will still be at work here. We shall be glad to welcome all who want to see and travel behind real engines.
With that statement, you can tell that the Fat Controller isn't one of those cruel controllers Percy mentioned. Though he is strict about the way his railway runs and does punish the engines when they do wrong, they are never scrapped. It's good to have a controller who cares. Enterprising Engines also showed the valiance and determination steam engines had. Henry's rescue of 2 failed diesels and Douglas's rescue of Oliver, an engine on the run from the scrapyard, showed the resourcefulness and bravery of the Fat Controller's engines. In spite of their depressing beginnings, these stories all resolved favorably and showed the usefulness of steam engines. We can be sure that all the engines Sir Topham had overseas are running happily to this day, steam and diesel alike. The second to last book of the original Railway series gave us stories about an engine named Duke, a little old engine who lived on a line with 2 younger engines, Stuart and Falcon. Because Duke got his name from the Duke of Sodor, he always tried keeping the other engines in order, saying,
"That would never suit his grace,"
whenever they did anything wrong. Stuart and Falcon gave him the nickname Grandpuff, which also served as the title to the first story in this book. One day when they tease Duke, he tells them to mind how they behave or they would end up like Number 2. I know what you're thinking and I'm not making the joke. Now, Number 2 was a cocky American engine who often derailed by running too roughly. Even with a warning from Duke, he still remained unconcerned about his behavior.
"Listen, bud, in the States we don't care a dime for a few spills."
Then one day, Number 2 gets his just desserts after the manager tells him he was going to be made useful at last. Stuart and Falcon learn that Number 2 is now a pumping engine residing in an enclosed area behind the engine shed, and there he is, imprisoned by his own conceit, not unlike Henry in the first Railway series book. However, things weren't as fortunate for Number 2 as they were for Henry. Now, the reason this book is called Duke the Lost Engine is because after many years, the line is closed down, and while Stuart and Falcon are brought by some people, Duke is left alone in the shed. Once Duke has been sheeted snugly and shut in, he goes to sleep, and everything around him changes. The shed becomes covered by bushes, trees, and vegetation of all kind, becoming invisible to any onlookers or passers-by. Duke remains buried in there for years before a team of men set out to rescue him. They eventually find him when one of them, called the Fat Clergyman, steps on the roof of Duke's shed and comes crashing through it, landing right on top of Duke, legs astride. Ouch! Never thought I'd see that kind of slapstick in the books. So Duke gets rescued and is brought to the narrow gauge line where Stuart and Falcon, now called Peter Sam and Sir Handel respectively, reside. Nothing is ever said about the fate of Number 2, on the other hand. The book never mentioned him again after his appearance in the first story and a small cameo in an illustration for the second. His fate remained a mystery until a Railway series tie-in book called The Island of Sodor, Its People, History, and Railways was published. According to this book, Number 2 had a real name, and was apparently transferred to a mine sometime after his appearance in this book to be used as a pumping engine again. He broke down one year, causing the mine to flood, as well as the railway itself to close. He ended up being scrapped. So, what we have here is another case of the rude and careless being dealt a brutal and karmic punishment. To be fair, Stanley was kind of at fault for Duke's line closing down, and he didn't do very much to garner sympathy. Careless and insensible don't fare very well in these books. Moral of story, as long as you're obnoxious and inconsiderate, you'll always be Number 2. I just made the joke. So now you've seen and heard some of the scariest stories the original Railway series had to offer, all made possible by the Reverend W. Awdry. After he retired, following the final book in the series, Christopher Awdry took up his father's pen and wrote a further 16 volumes of stories featuring many of these same engines. In comparison to his father's work, Christopher's books weren't as dramatic or exciting. Sure, there were some occasional moments, but by and large, the works of the younger Audrey were relatively tame and pedestrian, so I'm not including anything from those books here. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed hearing some dramatic Railway series tales. As popular as the TV series is, we shouldn't forget about its literary source material. It showcased more than a few exciting adventures from some lovable locomotives. Hopefully, their stories will still endure, and these engines will still be appreciated for years to come.